So, welcome to today's Adventures in Learning podcast. This episode officially makes me the most popular mom on the planet, at least with my two daughters, Miranda and Ella. They grew up obsessed with our next guest, absolutely adored Laurie Halse Anderson's books. They were huge fans of Speak and Chains and Forge and Ashes. And I will confess that when I got my advanced reader copy of Rebellion 1776, I might have shared it with them as well. And they both said to tell Laurie that she is the most amazing author in the world, and they're so happy she's on the show. So you all are in for a treat. Laurie, welcome to the show.
Oh gosh. Now can we end right now because that's just kind of mind-blowing all of that. But thank you. I appreciate the kind words. Hi, how you doing?
So, so you have a brand new book coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted Rebellion 1776?
Oh my gosh. I have so much to tell you. So, I'd written a lot about the American Revolution, and I had never really looked at Boston because I figured, well, we had Johnny Tremaine. So, moved on to other things. But then I got COVID very early during the pandemic, in the first few weeks of it, and was pretty sick, but thankfully came out of it okay. But was just flattened the way so many people were and spent several weeks on the couch. And I vaguely remembered that Abigail Adams this is when we were all hoping for a vaccination for
Right.
COVID. And I vaguely remembered the scene in the John Adams HBO series in which Abigail Adams had herself and her children inoculated against smallpox. And all things Abigail Adams, right? She's just one of
Right.
my big heroes. But I remembered vaguely, again, I'm still like sick and kind of smelly and, just pondering things. I knew that historians were unhappy with the way that inoculation was shown on the screen. So I wondered, well, what the heck happened? And because there's so many incredible primary sources have been digitized in the past couple of years, I was able to find all of Abigail Adams' letters that she ever wrote that we ever have, including
Amazing.
those that she wrote in the summer of 1776, when indeed she and her children and all of her relatives were inoculated against smallpox. And that happened actually in Boston, not out on their farm. And the details of that process made me go, "Oh my gosh. There were the most incredible things in the world happening in Boston in 1776." And I was wrong about Johnny Tremaine. Johnny Tremaine ends just at the beginning of the Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. So I thought, okay, nobody's talked about this space. Here I go. And Abigail took me down the rabbit hole, and my main character, Elspeth Culpepper, pulled me out the other side.
Well, and tell us a little bit about Elspeth because I thought she was charming and interesting. And I love the fact that she's not perfect. She's flawed just like everybody else is. Um,
Right.
Tell us a little bit about your inspiration for Elspeth.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've written several times about the lives of children held in slavery during the American Revolution. The problem is that so much of our primary source material, especially visual material, comes from families of profound wealth. And so I I wanted to write about a kid who I could have been from a working class family with a stubborn child who could have been a little bit like me. Um, but I know a little bit about the limits that were placed on working class kids, and also the concept of having to go to the almshouse if you are orphaned or your parents can't care for you, being bound out to complete strangers for your whole life if there's nobody around. So once I started to go down there and see really children had a different kind of growing up. But regardless of whenever you live, regardless of what the rules are in any society, we still experience the emotions of adolescence, right? Becoming close to friends, getting frustrated with parents, having maybe a little bit of a short temper, and having the biggest and best heart filled with dreams and hope, regardless of what's going on around us. So the characters just are magic. They come out of the ether. I can point to a couple of different things I found in my research, but really she just arrived, and took over the story. And I think I was pretty happy writer that day.
That's awesome. And I noticed there were a couple little Easter eggs in there for fans of Chains and Forge. And I certainly appreciated finding those as a reader who has used those books before. Thank you for putting those in.
My pleasure.
Was there something, did you feel like there were things that were untold in the previous trilogy that it gave you joy to sort of sneak in a little reference here and there?
Yeah, because we had in the trilogy, you have the first and the third books are told from the same point of view of Isabel. And we learn a little bit about Curzon, who's the male character, who's her buddy, who is from Boston. And you get little snippets of his childhood experience, but not nearly as much as we had from Isabel and her sister Ruth. So by having some of the secondary characters, although they're not really on screen, on stage, in Rebellion 1776, you hear about them. There is one notable character who's only in the book a little bit, who was the father of the man who held Curzon in slavery. This is a house that Curzon would have been in. And so it's almost like, the house holds its own stories, and our main character, Elspeth, doesn't know really about him, because she came on the scene before, after he left. No, before he left. And the other thing that I have to talk about is the character of Boston, right?
Yes.
And just it is so hard for us to imagine today how chaotic life was. The British had occupied Boston, starting in the late 1760s, and in 1774, they were really upset because all that tea was floating around the harbor. So the king and the parliament just brought the hammer down on the town of Boston and made life very difficult, to the point that communities as far away as South Carolina were sending donations of food and money and supplies to the people of Boston. It was intense. And then once we have the kind of the spark that really lit the war, which was at Lexington and Concord in 1775, Boston becomes a city under siege. Most of the civilians who lived there fled because they knew, oh no, this is bad. Here comes the Continental Army, and it's going to start shooting at the British. The British are going to shoot back, and I don't want to be caught in the middle. But some people were caught in the middle. My main character is a kitchen maid in the house of a wealthy judge, and she's living through this experience. And so, there's struggles of immense things that the characters go through. But I think that once I saw how much the experience of Boston was reflecting our own experiences today, that's what really captured me, because I'd already had this character in my head, and I went, oh my goodness. Because not everybody agreed that we should be independent. And in Boston, because of the taxation problems, there had been longer conversations about being a British colony. Are we British? Are we what? And you had in Boston and surrounding communities, families splitting apart because of politics. Some really supporting the king, others maybe they're not ready for an independent country, but they were really angry at the king. And this political divide just widened and widened and widened. And then when you layer onto that, so you've got literally a war in your backyard, and then the British are kicked out for a little while, and they head down to New York City, and you have this town in ruins with strong political feelings. And just at that moment, that's when the smallpox epidemic takes off. They had an early form of vaccination back then. Boston was the place that we believe it was first used in 1721. But now these town fathers agreed to have an inoculation period, because you couldn't just inoculate if you wanted to back then, because you could spread the disease. When you were inoculated with smallpox, you would get a mild version of the disease. And there were people who didn't believe in inoculation, and they thought that was scary, or they didn't understand it. And so I was like, oh my gosh, here we are again. So I try very hard when I'm writing historical fiction to stay grounded in the primary sources and to not say or have characters do things that we would do today, but they didn't do back then. But I will say it was in a way comforting for me to see that our country has been through these very challenging kinds of circumstances before. And just as characters, like all the characters in my historical fiction, young people, they grow up to be that founding generation, if you will, of Americans. And that lets me know that today's kids, my readers, your readers, they're that next generation who are going to do it better and smarter than we did. There is hope of coming through hard times. And looking back at this historical time period, we wound up becoming a new nation out of it. So hopefully there can be something good and positive today too.
Well, and I'm so glad you brought all of that up because I definitely picked up on those themes when I was reading it. It struck me how similar
Mm.
we were in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the political divides. And I like the fact that you also are able to articulate a little hope because sometimes it's hard to find hope in these days. So it's nice to be able to think about it that way. And as you said, we've been here and it's what do we do with the time now?
Exactly.
In terms of your school visits, when you present this book and your other books to kids, what are some of the big questions that come up or the things that you want them to walk away with?
Oh, that's such a great question. I always have visuals. I think it's really important especially when you're talking to a large group of kids in an auditorium or a gym. You have to communicate at many different levels to them. So I've got visuals going on, and then I try to bring my best energy. And I try to shatter the preconceived notion that I think too often our children have about the founding time period of the United States. Because I feel that kids look at pictures of the founding fathers who were wealthy white men, often holding people in slavery, and people who would not, we tell the kids, oh, these are our heroes. And kids today are like, really? And we have to find a way to honor those fellows, that generation, but at the same time, let's be honest. And that's something that's so important to me because I've done a lot of reading and talked to a lot of historians, and the fact that when we can begin to talk honestly about our country, about our history, about what we did wrong, about what we did right, about what we hope to do better, then we can have some real progress. So my first job, I'm starting to wander here. Going to come back to the point. My first job is to make kids be aware that there were kids then, and to take the focus off of the founders and make the world come alive. We do world building in historical fiction in the same way that fantasy writers do, right? I can't compare the color orange of a dress or cloth to a basketball or a school bus. I have to only, use the kind of language and the kind of world that my character is living in. So I want to give a lot of details about what the food tastes like, what the room smells like, what the poop on the road smells like, the sounds and the smells and the heat and the cold and the fires. And so by bringing that to life, now generally, if you can describe that well, a child who's like between 8 and 15 who's reading is hooked because it's another world and their mind is really open to new experiences. So then I'm trying to weave a story where I have a character who is being affected, often in frightening ways, because the world is hard by outside influences, but we still see that they're like our kids today and they have their interior life that they're trying to develop and grow. So I want to get the focus off of the leadership of the revolution and back on ordinary people.
I like that. And honestly, that's a really good segue to where the kids are today because so much of what's going on in our country is happening due to ordinary people who are standing up and speaking up. And so I think that by showing them what democracy looks like
Mm,
and how hard a struggle it is to uphold a democracy, you're doing a really powerful thing.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And you said something else that I'm really intrigued by because I know as an educator, historical fiction could be a hard sell to kids at times.
Mm,
And good historical fiction does exactly what you said. It captures them in the same way fantasy does because you're creating this world and you've got limitations because you've got to ground that world in a reality that existed at the
correct,
time.
correct.
But I guess I kind of wonder as you're building the world, you find these interesting details. How do you do the research to be able to do that sort of world building?
Very slowly, which is why there's a long time between my books. I spent almost 5 years researching this book. I was researching all the way through all the edits and the last drafts because there's always more to know, especially now when there's been such incredible digitization work by the Massachusetts Historical Society, Harvard, Yale, New York Public Library, Boston Public Library. So many places have digitized the primary sources. Sometimes they're transcribed, more often they're not. So I'm paging through, for example, medical journals by the doctors who are working that during that smallpox epidemic, and getting the details from all of that. The more granular you can be with your details, I think that sets the tone for the whole book. I do have one word of suggestion or advice, if I
Yeah,
may.
of course.
I share your sadness over the fact that some historical fiction leaves kids kind of yawning. And not every book is going to be for every reader. We know that, and we have to respect, what they like. But at least with my books, my historical fiction, please feel free to call them adventure novels
Ooh, I like that.
because that's what they are. They're in a different time period. And I think for some readers, when they hear historical fiction, they think, oh no, there's going to be a quiz at the end, and it's going to be deathly boring because we could do a little bit better with teaching our history in this country.
Yes.
But I try to write adventure novels.
And I like the notion of adventure novels or opening portals to other worlds because whenever
Mm,
you pick up a good book, that's what it does for you is it connects you in some way, whether it's to 1776 Boston or to the world of the giver or to the picture book that you happen to be reading about home.
right, right, exactly. That's the magic of story.
Exactly. So I do want to move into more grown up topics in a few
Mm.
minutes. But before we do that, history. How did you develop your love of history? Tell us a little bit about what got you going in this realm.
There are two things that really come to mind. The first is that my father was an incredible storyteller. And I grew up listening to him tell stories. A lot of his family came over during the Irish potato famine, and he grew up as a young boy in Troy, New York, where all of his relatives worked in the factories. And
I know Troy. I
oh,
have
okay, that's
family from
wonderful.
Troy as well, sort of the
There you
same
go.
Irish potato farmers.
Yes, yes, exactly. So I would sneak down the stairs at night to listen to my dad telling stories. He was so that always sparked my imagination. And then it took me a little while to learn how to read, a little bit longer than most of my friends. But when I finally managed to read a whole novel, it was Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie, which we know that is problematic content. And I really highly recommend that everybody read Prairie Lotus by Linda Sue Park, which is the same time period, but wow, mm, it's elevated. It's amazing. But I can remember finishing that book, and it was like the thickest book I'd ever finished at that point. And I was so shocked because I had read so many pages. I read the whole thing on my own. And I when I was in that book, every I hope every child has this moment when you are gone. You are so entranced in the story, you are not there. You are in the story. And it felt like I was swimming up to the surface of the ocean at the end of that book and just drawing in a deep breath. And I didn't become a writer in that moment, but I became somebody who was obsessed with history.
I love that. And it certainly carries through to what you do today. And your books are such a treat for us.
I appreciate that.
So let's turn to the grown up stuff. We know that we're living in a time where we're facing greater book bans and challenges to books. And you've sort of been at the forefront in terms of defending the freedom to read. Can you talk a little bit about what that journey has been like for you and sort of some of the challenges and resources that we can cling to now?
Um, First and foremost, everybody needs to be aware of the work of PEN America. And PEN America, there are several different organizations that are trying to track what's being banned, where, why, all the circumstances. This is a very large country. We don't have standardized reporting in education. And that's one of the things that's challenging us the most. But PEN America, if you're ever wanting to just brush up on where we're standing right now, they are issuing regular reports with the data about what books are being banned, who's driving the bus. In some areas, and the laws change from state to state. One person, I'm thinking of some areas in Florida, one person can have 600 books removed from a school district. There are definitely coordinated movements going on. The group called Moms for Liberty is one of the ones that's behind this, but it's not the only one.
No,
I've been accused, the first time I was ever accused of being a pornographer was actually back in 2011. And boy, that was kind of a wake-up call. But in the old days, meaning before 2021, when people wanted to censor my books, usually they didn't want their kids to read Speak. And I've tried to have conversations with the parents, and I think it is a parent's job to keep an eye on what a kid is reading.
of course.
Um, but that kind of like old-fashioned pre-2021 censorship has nothing to do with what we're seeing today.
Right.
What we're seeing today is not one family going, I don't think my kid's ready for that book. What we're seeing today is a very well-funded, dark money driven, extremist kind of culture wars aspect where uh, a group of wealthy people who I can't even begin to understand are somehow so freaked out because kids have access to books that have black and brown characters in them, or that have gay or non-straight or non-cisgendered characters, or heaven forfend, they might pick up a library book that explains the way their body works.
Right.
My books, I'm censored because Speak and Shout have sex in them, allegedly. I would call it they have sexual violence in them. Um, but that's considered, quote, a sex act. I was asked if I thought that it was right when people in Iowa were banning Speak, that what did I think when they said that the rape was sexually provocative. And I said anybody who finds the rape of a 13-year-old sexually provocative has larger problems and should seek professional help.
That's a great answer.
Yeah. But here's the thing that we have to remember, because at some point we're going to have to start having conversations,
Right.
right? The leadership of the extremists on the right are never going to come to the table. But there are, I suspect, millions of people that they've manipulated who at some point are going to go, oh, I didn't understand that, or I didn't know that, or whatever. I'm here to tell you, I have 7 grandkids. If anybody told me, anybody that I trusted said, the kids, your grandkids, are being exposed to pornography in their school, I wouldn't believe it. But if this person like says, no, really, really, it's happening, you, who knows, right? Most kids see their first pornography on their phones. I would start asking questions because that is such an outrageous, scary violation of the rights of children to do that to them. So the manipulators on the far right, they found the right tool, and they know that if they keep people angry and if they keep people frightened, they can get money out of them and they can get their votes. I think that the rest of us who live in sort of the middle of the political road, we were very slow to react because we didn't believe it. And um, I think all of the work that has been done in the last 12 years, especially by groups like We Need Diverse Books,
Yes.
about by publishers who are finally opening up their doors, both in terms of hiring people who represent every single group in America and have all kinds of backgrounds and understandings that people who look like me don't have, as well as publishing and promoting the stories
Yes.
of people who don't come from the old, that little tiny box of white people. And this is why our children's literature is so vibrant up until 2021. And the pushback had everything to do with the exact same pushback that we've experienced politically since President Obama was elected in 2008. There are a group of people in our country who somehow think that living in 1850 was better than living in 2025.
And as a
And they want
historian,
that.
you could tell them that's not really the case.
Not really, not at all. They're living a fantasy that somebody created for them. And that I worry, I'm horrified for our kids, for all of them. I am equally horrified and heartbroken for all of our educators. It's never been easy to be an educator in this country. And now, I mean, so many of them are just, they have to quit to save their lives, literally. But also, I'm also very, very worried about this rising generation of children's book authors and illustrators. That wave that came in when the publishing industry finally listened to Walter Dean Myers and opened the doors. I'm thinking about Nick Stone and Angie Thomas and Jason Reynolds and Giles Lamar, everybody. I can list them forever. Um, there are no more school visits for people of color. Schools are not putting school visits on. I barely have any school visits because my name is on the blacklist of Mothers for Liberty. And so what happens for this, I mean, I'm grown, my kids are grown, but if I was a young new author and I was walking into our world and all of a sudden one of the most important income streams is shut down, we're losing stories. We're losing important stories. And the fact that the books of this new generation of diverse creators have been taken off the shelves, have been robbed from the children and destroyed, that's criminal.
I
It is absolutely, it's malpractice.
and it's so important. I absolutely hear what you're saying. There's the extreme Moms for Liberty and other groups like that. And there's that need, as you were pointing out, to find some empathy for those who maybe were initially trying to do that thing you were saying, my kid's not ready at this moment,
Right.
but have been taken in by
Mhm.
a few people. And it's sort of, how do we support teachers and families in making the choice that you need to make for your own kids, but not making a choice that impacts everybody else's children? And that's the
Exactly.
difference, because what's good for my kids may not be good for yours. But I do know that we are so much stronger as a community when we lift up diverse voices, diverse books, when we embrace what Radine Sims Bishops talked about in terms of windows
Yes.
and mirrors. That's not just for children of color. White children need that too. And
Exactly.
maybe every bit as much, because if your perspective is limited, you're not going to know how to engage in a global world. And so much of the world that they're facing, if we look at the world they're entering into, there are jobs that don't exist yet. And they're going to have to connect and collaborate and create together to be able to do those jobs. And one of the ways you set them up for success is by letting them get lost in these portals of adventure, told by authors from every background and perspective. And they develop that empathy muscle as they're working through their reading. And it doesn't mean that every kid has to read every book at every moment.
That's right. And that's why you have trained certified professionals in your educational spaces. I think we can boil it down to a very simple phrase. And this is something that we're still struggling with at the national level. We have struggled with it ever since our founding. And it's understanding me versus we, right? The concept of, oh, America, freedom and independence and all that. But in truth, a culture does not survive unless people are watching out for each other. We have public education because since the very founding of the country and even before, communities recognized that public education of all children was a value to the growth and the safety and the future of the community. But part of that in our sphere today means that your trained professionals, your educators, your librarians, overseen by their supervisors, will choose the books that are appropriate developmentally for the kids in the age bracket that they're serving. And every single family in that community deserves to have a broad choice of reading material for their kid, right? So,
Okay.
but here's how we solve this problem so simple. We tell the people who are censoring the books what a wonderful choice that you're making for your child because you don't want your child to read those. Get your hands off the book that my child wants to take out of the library. Mind your own business, right? Just the concept that some rando in some corner of a county can pull 600 books from a school district. Did I miss something? Was that one person crowned the chart in put in charge of curriculum development and library management? It is absurd. And I really feel that those of us who are trying to get back to common sense, trying to get back to libraries that are open and robust, we just have to boil down the message. It's tempting to go into all the different places. Just say you've always been able to tell the librarian you don't want your kids to take out books about X. You've always been able to do that. You've always been able to ask for a different reading book for a kid in an English class.
Yeah.
So get your fingers off my family's kids. Get your fingers off the books that my children want to read. Mind your own business.
And wouldn't it be nice if we all did that and opened up a sphere where we could read and maybe start exchanging ideas again?
Well, yeah, yeah, I think a lot about, and going back to Boston in
Yeah.
1776, that great political divide. And I was reading letters written back and forth because there were men who supported the king, who felt so strongly about supporting the king that they left with the British Army. They evacuated. And a lot of the wives stayed here. There are families that were split, husbands and wives, siblings, parents, children. And reading the letters is heartbreaking. There were some people who never reconciled, but there were a lot of those husbands who left eventually came back. And they were very worried. They were very worried about how they would be received. They were older, and I think that I'm I'm trying to learn from what has happened before. Obviously, situations change generation to generation, but the concept of having communities torn apart by manufactured or not manufactured problems, that's only the first part. Wars are very easy to start, culture wars and physical wars, very easy to start. The real challenge comes in the rebuilding afterwards. It's important to think about during the beginning of the American Revolution in 1776, when George Washington and his army was just a stone's throw away from where I'm sitting, trying to figure out how to kick the British out of Boston. They weren't thinking about starting a new country. Those thoughts, they were like, no, we're dealing with this. And so I think the more we start thinking a couple of years ahead about what do we want the next, America 2.0,
Right.
2.50, right? We're almost at our 250th birthday. Let's start planning for what that looks like now.
It's the vision building phase. And when I
Oh,
think about education and I think about the way we learned history, we spend so much time on the Civil War and then we always skipped over Reconstruction. Or,
yeah.
you spent like a week on Reconstruction. And so there were so many stories that got lost, stories about what really happened in the South, about the contributions of African Americans, about the tragedies when prejudice reared its ugly head again and shut it all down. And those are lessons we need right now as we envision what America 2.5 would look like in terms of how do we build forward so that we truly are a country that is for all the people.
And you know what? That's that promise, the promise of the Declaration of Independence, which we haven't yet fulfilled. It's a great lofty promise. But that promise is the sacred one. that has brought the millions of brilliant, hardworking, courageous immigrants to our country, that saw the millions of families who were kidnapped victims and had to live through generations of slavery still rise up, raising their kids and believing in this country, even as many people in the country were treating them so badly. So let's focus on that sacred dream, a country that is for everybody. That's, kind of a magnificent thing we could get right next time.
I like
And
that.
I think books are a way to help.
Well, and you kind of have segued into my final question for today, which is what brings you hope?
Oh, just spending time with kids, you know. We as grown-ups it can be, I think we feel the fear more deeply because we grew up in a time of relative peace. For the kids today, I mean, they all didn't go to school during COVID and they're ready for things that are hard. They've already grown up with them. But they're still kids, right? And they're joyful and what I love most about kids and teens is that innate, it's got to be in our DNA, sense of fairness.
Mm-hmm.
If you need some hope, go talk to sixth graders about justice and what's right and what's wrong and how should our laws work. Um, Capitalism makes it hard to hold on to that sometimes because if you have to make really hard decisions to pay your bills and take out loans for education and pay for health insurance, wow, a lot gets lost in the mix. But maybe that's part of the reimagining. So hanging out with kids and being humble and smart enough to listen to kids instead of telling them things. I think perhaps at this point in our culture, we could learn more from children than they can learn from us.
I 100% agree with that. Laurie, thank you for joining me on the Adventures in Learning podcast this week. And folks, go out and get your copy of Rebellion 1776. It is a read you are absolutely going to fall in love with. And maybe that will help get you in that mind to help us plan for America 2.5. Laurie, thank you.
I appreciate all of your time. Thanks so much for the opportunity.